If we have an exceptional threat, please think exceptional ideas. You can't ask 6 billion Asians, which is what the population of Asia will be in 2050, to live European or American lifestyles. No chance. So to stop them, you have to create a different narrative about a different world vision. People are not born with some view that they need to have a house, 3,000 square foot, a swimming pool, TVs in every room, and 2 cars. And the how, or the prerequisite, in my view, is the strong state. But it's a state which is very competent.
Okay, Chandran, listen. Sustainable state that's the starting point, and I'm sure we will be touching upon the consumptionomics as well, because it's a serious part of the book. But I would like you to explain to me briefly, in the beginning of the book, you describe quite vividly the lack of progress, the emptiness of discourse when international meetings on sustainability are organized, either by the UN or by big corporations. Why is it so difficult to have a serious conversation on sustainability with major players in the world?
Well, I think it's difficult because when you go to these convened sessions, whether it's a conference, etc., there is a set agenda. There are vested interests at play, whether it's a UN or it's run by a multinational company or it's run by one of those large global forums. So,
what are the vested interests?
Oh, the vested interest is to perpetuate a certain way of thinking. So if it's run by, one of the large business forums, then it's about how companies can apparently do this. So you get a bunch of CEOs talking a bunch of nonsense, right? So then they talk about environmental protection as sustainability, because fundamentally, as I argue in the book, not that companies are bad, we need companies, etc., but companies are not in the business of doing less. Companies in the business of doing more. So you can't, asking companies to take on essentially a public good issue is an oxymoron. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. So they don't do this. You can't ask Pizza Hut to sell less pizzas, right? But you can make regulations that essentially start to define what might be the healthy amount. So what happens is, and I'll try and keep this short, but is essentially intellectual dishonesty is the motivation for my book, has captured all segments of the conversation on sustainability, which I found so frustrating, because I thought there would be an open conversation, but it's intellectually dishonest. It's a currency of our times.
Does that mean that none of us is serious when we talk sustainability?
No, I think there's 2 things. Clearly, there are many people who are very serious. They're scientists, etc., doing serious work, but they don't get to speak. They don't get to the platforms, and frankly, sometimes when they speak, everyone falls asleep because it's not exciting enough, and sometimes they are, of course, also constrained by careers, etc. So people then almost dilute what they want to say. So I felt someone like me, who's I like to think free from the clutches of wages, etc., or feels that that's the only way to engage, should speak up.
You're free because you're rich enough?
It's nothing to do with rich, actually. I come from a very poor background, but I was fortunate enough to get into consulting business, etc., and ran it, and then I cashed out. But it's not about I wouldn't consider wealth or money to do anything with it, but the ability to exercise a bit of that economic freedom to now take on something else. We know that most of and not to demonize wealthy people, but people don't know even where to stop. And a lot of people, I think, are fearful of essentially putting themselves out publicly away from the mainstream. So I think this is clearly one of the problems we face.
But if we talk about sustainability, then we're looking for ways to make an economic system and a societal system work in the long run. And there's this catchphrase that I've been using the past few weeks. Somebody used it saying tempus nullius. He's comparing the future to what Australia or New Zealand were for the British when they colonized it, and they said it is Terra Nullius, it belongs to nobody, so we can occupy it and exploit it. That's what we do with the future, right? And so sustainability should make an end to that kind of practice. We should not abuse the future or abuse resources that belong to the future for our consumption today. Is that a definition that you could live with?
Well, that is a classic definition, and it's a nice one to have, but it's a definition that all of us can live with. So what? But the reality is very different. So my argument is slightly different. And I think this is one of the problems. Much of the phrasing on sustainability, etc., is to make everyone feel that we all care and that we want to do something, but it doesn't cut deep enough into the bone marrow, as I call it. So this book basically suggests, and why I wrote it as well, is I've been very intrigued that most of the narrative about sustainability has been framed by Western thought leaders. I think you will agree with me on that. I thought this is rather odd. I mean, part of it is, of course, the capture of the intellectual space, the discourse on economics, etc., is essentially captured by the Western world. That's beginning to change and creating great discomfort. But if you look at sustainability, most of the narrative is a Western. And I thought it's rather odd that the people who come from the most unsustainable societies in the world are now going to tell people who don't have even the basics what sustainability is going to look like, and then come up with agreements like the Paris Agreement, etc., which are essentially methods of keeping the status quo. So I look at it differently, and if you give me a minute. So we live in the 21st century where we have essentially clear evidence now that, let's take climate, and I think climate is not the only issue, but it becomes something that everyone wants to talk about. But we've reached a stage where everyone knows that essentially there's no more essentially trying to control it, fighting it. It's just a question of mitigation and essentially coping with it. So it's coping. But the problem is, it's a rituals mindset about now how to live with climate change even. The reality, unfortunately, is the majority of the world don't have the basics. To provide them with the basics, they have all on the same time being told there's an economic model which you must embrace. Who are the purveyors of this? Essentially the institutions of the world, which are essentially mostly led by the West. For the IMF, the World Bank. I'm not trying to be divisive or blame, but that's what they're told. There's an economic model, and you all better follow this. That economic model, as you mentioned earlier, is an economic model which is at war with the planet and people. The evidence is very clear. So how do we ask now, how do we get people, the majority of which don't have the basics, things that you and I take for granted and they don't have, and ask them, on one hand, we need to have a sustainable future, whichever way you want to define it. But let's just talk about today, next 20 years. But then adopt an economic model, which is essentially one based on plunder, based on exceptionalism. It was an economic model fashioned around essentially the period of exploitation, extraction, and essentially exceptionalism. It was colonization. That economic model has now been refined into a different language of sophistication and economic theories, but exported to the world. So can the rest of the world have this model? I'm arguing cannot. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. But these people do have a right to the basics. Food, clean and safe, shelter, water sanitation, basic power, healthcare, etc. Just to provide that will rock the world. So how do you do this? And that's my argument, that the sustainability discussion needs to be completely turned around from the lens of some controls here and there to complete rethinking of how will the majority of the world get their rights served and at the same time not destroy the world. And that means, and I'll finish, that means limiting what they can have, which Western thought leaders will never get into that space, because then they think they start to they get into the domain of discussing political rights and freedoms and the individual right, which is sacrosanct in the Western liberal order. So this is why I wrote the book, to say we do not have rights to everything. Car ownership is not a human right. Try selling that in the United States.
Or Europe, for that matter.
Yeah.
But so you don't answer the question about definition of sustainability.
I'm not interested, because I think the definition is warped. It doesn't ask the right question about what is the challenge.
But the challenge is not, it's double, right? It's on the one hand, providing all 7+ billion, and in 20 years' time, we're about 10 billion people with basic rights, and at the same time, do that in a way that is sustainable.
Okay, that's the point, basic rights. The problem is a minority are living well beyond basic rights. So then that's why I described it without wanting to be divisive. The modern world, which is essentially the West, and parts of the developing world, I would include in that in Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and then there's Dubai, etc., essentially have fulfilled basic needs. Those countries, you can't tell them now, we have to have an equilibrium where you'll just have your basic rights met, because those people are not going to sacrifice. So that's why I've argued, I don't believe the West can adjust to this new reality when this majority will have to have their basic rights met. This is intolerable, because this people meeting these basic rights, which is I consider the rights, will create a messy world. So why I've avoided answering your question in the way you've asked me is to get us to understand a more complex situation. So I argue the 21st century will be very messy, because the majority have a right to those basic needs. It is essentially the dilemma of the human condition in the 21st. The question is, how do we navigate this over the next 50 years? And my view is Western economic and political theories will not be able to deal with that, because it hides away from the past and the need to make sacrifice, which is both from the freedom side and political structures. So that's kind of where I think the Europeans have a better chance, if I'm to be honest.
Yeah.
I think the Americans
might not be
cannot.
kind to us.
Yeah, but Americans cannot. So we cannot look for answers coming out.
But if we cannot, then what?
But the good news is it doesn't matter, because you're only 15%, if I can be so crude. It doesn't matter. That's the good news. The problem is we want to be better than you. And the West is saying, follow our economic model. But meanwhile, reduce your emissions. No way, it doesn't work. So the good news is the Western world, with 15% of the world's population, doesn't matter. If enlightenment comes to the West, good luck. I'm not putting my bets on that, okay?
But
the rest of the world needs to take care of this, and it has a completely different architecture of thinking about the future.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
Sure.
But just before, because in numbers,
yes,
you could argue 15% is not decisive.
Yes.
It's the billions of Asia that will decide whether we have a future or not.
Yes.
But the symbolic weight of the Western world is far higher than the demographic weight.
Yes.
Everybody wants to be the West in Asia as well.
So I'm just coming to it. So we need to reject that. So we, as subservient cultures, because of 3-4 centuries of colonization, if I can put, again, being polemic and using crude language, when we were decolonized, or we'd get, decolonized, we said we want you out. I'm not pointing at you, but generally.
The Brits.
The Brits, yeah. The Belgian people were good, I think. No, not really.
In Congo.
I know. I'm just kidding. People know history. But we want you out. But our elites, who knew nothing else, because they went to Oxford, Cambridge, they went to Harvard, they still go there, said, but I want to be like you. Because I don't know anything else. Even my history I didn't write. Even my philosophy, my art and culture. I was told that literature is Shakespeare. No one told me that there are Tibetans who were thinking about philosophy, etc. I was told that the best form of modern dance is ballet. I was told there was nothing else in the world. I was told that was the Renaissance, as though the rest of the world was dark. This is complete nonsense. But this is how the world was built. We understand that. Mm-hmm. So we don't know anything else. So what you have to understand is we want revenge now. So if you got 2 cars, I'm going to have 3. If you got tall buildings, my God, we are going to have taller buildings. And if you got malls, my God, we're going to have bigger malls. Where are the biggest malls in the world? In Asia. Our revenge. Where are the tallest buildings? Ours. And then, my God, we're going to buy your best things. And on the one hand, the West is confused. Because on the one hand, he wants Asia to grow and Africa to grow. Why? Because our subservience will continue to force us and compel us to buy Western goods. And therefore, it keeps the economy going. But the more we do that, the more we essentially, supplant, but also create the carbon footprints, etc., that we talk about. So we can't have, the American dream. It's impossible. In fact, it's not good. But no one's saying we should not have that. The economic theories we've all been subjugated to is more is better, and everyone can have everything, and freedom is unfettered. But I'm saying our freedoms are completely have to be restrained.
Would you say freedom is overrated?
Totally, yeah. Depends what you mean by freedom.
If
it's individualistic freedom, then that's a Western obsession. Western obsession. In other countries, people are not so obsessed. But that's the ideological warfare now. The warfare between the promotion of the Western idea about liberalism and freedoms and these other societies which on one hand want to be like the West, but if they can be like us, it'll be good. So that's the tension of modernity, right?
But if we look at the freedom aspect and we're moving towards the kind of state then that you propose in the book, and because it's part of your solution of the quandary that we're facing, you're not exactly arguing drop the freedom and have authoritarian states.
I never use the word authoritarian.
Well, you do use it for saying...
I use the word authority, but not authoritarian. So this is also very important. So again, actually the title I had for the book originally was The Indispensable State. So, you take Western liberal democracies and there's all this mistrust, but particularly the United States of the state. But my God, as soon as someone attacks them, they want the state to go and bomb every other country in the planet, right? So, but the rules of any society are based on the institutions of the society. You can call it the state, you can call it the church, but there are rules. When there's no rules, everything breaks down. Then if you believe what I'm saying, that the 21st century will be unique in human experience, not just in climate, but the peaking of the population, the overreach of technology, and the crisis of essentially an economic model based on external, promoting relentless consumption while underpricing externalities. then you would agree, my God, we need order. That order is not going to come from nice NGO ventures about, organizing communities in the rainforests of Southeast Asia. It's going to
how
come.
important that is.
Yeah,
it's
but
not
it's
sufficient.
Not at all. And I have a chapter about this.
Yeah.
And this is, again, fantasy. Well, I'm very happy to support NGOs. They don't have the organizing ability. So you need the ability to organize on a large scale,
And
because
not
we
just organize, but enforce.
execute and enforce and take dramatic decisions that will alter the course of history in these countries.
Well, the last part was what I was going to ask about, because when we think of altering history and the challenges that we face, the challenges are global, are planetary in a sense. And your solution is national. Now, how does that fit the challenge, even if the state is performing? And we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But
I've written a piece about this, and so if those listening, they can find it. There's a very seductive discussion. Hey, everything is multilateral. I think this is hocus pocus. To have multilateral agreements, you have to have states that function first, because it's the collective effort of a state functioning within its borders, within its policies, that can contribute to a multilateral effort. So let's just take climate. All you need is the United States, China, and India to take actions locally to essentially make the greatest contribution to essentially fighting climate change. One country, the United States, has drawn out. One country, India, struggles because of its messy democratic systems. One country is able, and the UN report says, is one of the only countries meeting the climate targets. Which one is that? China. The ability to organize, take a long-term view, not worry about the election cycles, and make hard decisions about a shift in the entire way the society is going to be organized, and shape expectations around constraints.
so even if Bangladesh collapses, it doesn't matter either.
Bangladesh does matter, of course. I mean, all countries matter, but I'm just saying the three biggest ones that could make an impact would be those three. But to your point, Bangladesh needs to get organized or it will collapse. And my point is, its messy democracy will not allow it to get organized, given how complicated, as you've probably been there, how difficult the challenge is. And I would argue you need a strong state. I'm agnostic to what you want to call the political system. But essentially, it has to be a state that can be effective and essentially do things on a large scale and change behaviors.
But you don't sound agnostic when you talk about India or Bangladesh. It's always a messy democratic system.
No, I say I'm agnostic to what you want to call it.
Yeah,
But I am not agnostic about saying the current democratic systems in those large countries are completely ill-suited to what those countries' challenges are. And the evidence is absolutely clear. So in India, which is my parents' birthplace, and therefore, I have a particular desire to see India do well. I mean, suicide rates amongst farmers, it's ridiculous. This would never happen in China now, never. So who's responsible? The state is not present. The state is negligent. The state is incompetent.
Or the state is captured by
all of those things.
interests.
But it can only be captured when it's also incompetent. It's not strong enough. So whichever way, but the state must be strong and effective to be able to intervene both in the fractures that are taking place, either because of dislocation of resources, capture, and of course, in controlling the excesses of the free market.
Now, that argument would with that argument, we would be talking about the developmental state, as you phrase it, the state that is able to provide the basic minima for its people and basic rights. I mean, it's not just a little bit of a roof, but a sturdy house. I mean, all of that. What difference is there between a developmental state and a sustainable state?
Well, a developmental state is the state that first has fulfill its basic obligation, which I outline in the book. With the basic obligation of the state is to provide for the basic needs, and I outline them. Second is to then, through that provision, create a political system in which people understand the notion of what is called moderate prosperity and define that as a political philosophy. And third, for both of those to work, basically have a way to organize economic activity that essentially models that essentially depend on excessive externalization of costs and rent seeking are not allowed. So that's the basic. So that's the developmental state. Then when you get people to a certain level of meeting that, and it's large numbers, then you'd have to decide, because I'm not talking about a state in which everybody has the same thing. Please don't misunderstand me. Then you have to understand where are the boundaries at which you continue to allow people to prosper, people to thrive because people have ambitions, etc. But you do not allow that to an extent at which that need for people to prosper beyond the basics begins to undermine the rights of the majority. And that's the sustainable state that I am talking about. And more importantly, begins to deal with the existential threats, which are global. So it has to do certain things. So if you take China, for example, it is trying to deal now with the fact that, it's raised 500 million people out of poverty, as you know, or more. No human society has done this. Never. So I think China should get a Nobel Prize for economics. But the people is it Sweden or Norway, the Nobel?
For economics, I think it's Norway. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but, I'm just being cheeky there. But they should get a Nobel Prize for that. But at the same time, it's got a lot of people who still need to be uplifted and other aspirations. But the Chinese system and the Chinese culture has tools by which they can exercise that and bring those things to bear, to maintain the sustainable state locally so that they don't. And now the next challenge for China to also, what is its global responsibilities? Because it has global responsibilities.
But is that a possibility that China has? Because the inequalities have ballooned during this period of lifting people out of poverty.
Of course, because they followed the free market whilst they had the state, but the economic ideology was still lift people. Now, in that developmental stage, China was very poor. When you open up to those economic prescriptions, you are going to create the inequalities. But at the same time, I think the Chinese government now is addressing those issues without trying to create a socialist country in which everyone got the same thing. That is not what I'm talking about. And no country is going to be perfect. So there is the inequality, economic inequality, but then there's also the sustainability issue. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the data today, in terms of basic housing, food, water, sanitation, energy, China's education, China's in the 90s. This is an extraordinary achievement. But having done that, of course, they paid a price. And now they're trying to clean up. As you will know, today India has the largest proportion of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world. Beijing today the air pollution is not what it was 5 years ago. Why? The Chinese government's ability to move hundreds of factories on dictate. You will move, full stop. No discussion. So that ability to to change are the tools of the state. Of course, it can be abused, but if it's used in this way for this existential threat, then that's what I mean by the sustainable state.
And how worried are you that it might be abused? When you wrote the book, you were quite confident, it seemed to me. As I was reading it, you are aware of the challenges, but at least that was my feeling, you judged them as manageable in China, for instance. Since that, I think after the book was written, Xi Jinping got his lifetime mandate if he wishes to stay on in power. He is the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping or even Mao Zedong. We're seeing the re-education camps in Xinjiang. So there's a number of issues that might get you a little bit worried, no?
Well, you know, I'm not trying to be an expert all about China or any country. I'm saying if we believe that the world is faced with an existential threat in terms of resources, etc., which political and governance system and what expectations do we put on people in the large developing worlds to essentially meet their basic needs and then fulfill certain other aspirations. I'm saying at the moment China has done that. But I do not want to run away from your question about Xi Jinping, because I get this all the time in the Western world, like, so what? I'm not worried about that. But Western liberals are always worried about this. You know, but the United States had 2, 3 presidents duly elected who created havoc around the world, committed war crimes. So I'm not worried about it. Now, the Chinese people should decide and be worried if they think so.
How will they decide?
The Chinese system is
outside.
not a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other thing that people don't understand. And I'm not an expert, but please go and figure this out. But there's layers and layers and layers and years of planning. So, you know, in fact, just this week, I was someone, Chinese, who's very into the system. And he said, Xi Jinping was essentially already picked out as a possible leader 30 years ago to groom. Not because, you know, he looked like a fascist, because of capability. Then 30 years of essentially, together with 3 or 4 others, to equip them to become today's leaders. And there is a whole load of those people. So the Chinese system has more checks and balances than others. And if I'm very cheeky, but because this is Europe, I should be, I would argue that China is more democratic than India. So if you think that 800 million Indians next week going to vote is democracy, good for you. Does it create the great ideals and outcomes that democracy is supposed to deliver? The evidence is no. So we can also talk about what is the purpose of democracy and what is the nature of a democracy. So, you know.
But the strong state that you propose as a necessary condition almost to create...
To deal with these issues, yes.
To create sustainable outcomes.
Can be democratic.
You describe the state as not just the government sitting above the people,
that's right,
but as some relationship between the government and the people.
Absolutely.
And I have a little discomfort there because it sounds like this. How you call it? It's the kind of state idea that, and I was trying to avoid the reference to Italy under Mussolini, but it's that kind of the body of the people then produces the leader or the government.
No, that's not what I meant. And also, if you don't mind, all the time when people, you know, react to my notion of the strong state, they always have examples from the past, and usually it's something European. And I say, well, you know, Nazism and Mussolini is not my history. So why does everything have to have a terms of reference back? But we can have...
Well, we can refer to Mao Zedong.
Yeah, but Mao Zedong created a state through a revolutionary movement. We can argue about then whether he abused some of that power, etc. But
Chiang Kai-shek created the same kind of solidaristic type of state.
But what is Donald Trump doing today? What did George W. Bush do today over a period? They created a nationalist. The United States is that kind of state when it comes to exerting power elsewhere. But anyway, to your question.
The question is, if you see the state as a relationship between the people and government,
so it's not about populism.
That sounds good in philosophy, but I don't know how you put that into practice.
Well, you put it into practice in a democracy by saying, you elected these people. Why do you have such views, perverse views, that as soon as you elect someone, you feel somehow you need to check them all the time and bring them down? Rather than, so that's, I think that's this expansive view of freedom. We have this badge of honor, we have a democracy, we elected you, but my God, we're not going to allow you to do anything because if it's near my neighborhood, I'm going to stop you. Because I believe in these rights, I'm going to stop you. One person can take someone to the Supreme Court, so nothing happens. So, you know, I often use the argument, so India can't, it's so difficult for Indians to build train systems, modern train systems, because every Indian has a right to take the government to the Supreme Court. Whereas in China, they say, we're going to build from here to here, 500 kilometers.
Just get out of the way.
No, 50 million people will benefit. We have to move 10,000. The equation is very clear. For the benefit of 50 million, we will do something else. So that is a very different way of thinking about effectiveness of the state. But I must come to your point about the state. What I didn't mean is the Mussolini example that you gave, that there is some charismatic leader who then has a relationship with the people based on convincing them of some ideology. Not at all. I was talking about the ability of the institutions to be so deep-rooted that people respect those institutions and then seek to essentially continuously uphold those institutions irrespective of who the leader is and continue to build it. Now, for developing countries, this is very important. But let me give you a couple of examples, which I think I cited in the book. One is Japan. No one actually remembers, apart from the current Prime Minister Abe, who the last 6 were. I mean, they were so ineffectual. But what Japanese society works on is the notion of I am part of the state. Therefore, I contribute to the civility of holding together the institutions, which is not the department, but the institution of the public toilets. If you've been to Japan, you will know there's the cleanest toilets. But it's the institutional ability that I have a contract. I will not be disruptive. That is an example. The Koreans have the same. I would argue in Europe, you have some of those examples, some of them in the Scandinavian countries, but you have it in Germany too, where there's a respect. But in the developing country, the idea that somehow the state is the enemy, let's light the fire, well, you know what happens. So I argue we should build the state, because we are part of the state, rather than look at the state as something that is external to us. And this is what I'm talking. And I think China, there is this relationship between the people and the institutions because they respect it at all the levels, but they do question it without me anyway suggesting that there aren't risks. That would be stupid to say there aren't risks.
So we have a strong state that's built on reliable and functioning institutions,
yes,
rather than individuals.
Yeah, competent. Yeah.
Competent, and they deliver both the basic rights to people and do that in a way that they preserve resources and that they create a different model. I would like to get to that change of paradigm in economic terms? Because you started out briefly, and in the book you're more elaborate, saying how bad the system is and how unsustainable the current system is, because it drives us to consume more and more. And at one place in the book, you give the example of Singles Day in China, which is basically Alibaba Day, and more goods are sold in China on that one day than a whole year in Brazil, right?
Terrible.
So that consumption-driven
which is our economic model. Yeah.
That's the economic model. So where do we shift it to? What is the alternative?
Well, people need
how do we get there?
People need goods and services, and this is my what I discuss in the first book, and then it was to describe the economic model should be thought through rather than talking about sustainability as how do we preserve resources, use resources effectively while preserving it for the next generation. Well, the only way you can do it is to look at what is driving resource depletion. One, of course, is the fact that there are more human beings than ever before. They need stuff, meaning to just exist. We're not talking about mobile phones. People need food, etc., houses. That's materials. That sucks up the resource base. The other is the fact that we have an economic model that essentially now has been, mutated into its survival depending on you buying things you don't need with money you don't have. Debt. Or if you're middle class, to buy things you don't need with money you don't have to impress people you don't like, the neighbors, So that's what it's morphed into, selling, selling, selling. I'm not an activist from Greenpeace. So I'm not going to take away your desire. I'm not suggesting we take away your desire to consume a bit more. But I think we need to put as many disincentives in place that make sure your ability to consume more, for whatever reason that you have gained economic power, does not allow you to jeopardize the rights of others to their basic rights. And that is through pricing. So consumptionomics basically tried to say that if we are to deal with sustainability, first we need to deal with consumption which drives our economic models, and governments need to reject the idea, if they are to navigate the next 50 years in the more developing countries, that more consumption unfettered without paying for the externalities is a possibility. So can I give you one example, and not taking the developing world, but taking the first world. So California now is going to be one of the most water-stressed and climatically affected, and some of the data is scary in terms of how the frequency of fires. Someone has to do something in terms of essentially minimizing the cost of essentially a climate cycle that's gone out of control. Because you can't stop that. That's already in sequence. What you have to do is now mitigate. And you have to mitigate both how much water people use and where people live, because that's a cost. Only the state in California can do this. So it will say, you might be a Hollywood actress or actor, but you can't have a swimming pool. Sorry. You might be whatever, but you can't live on that range because it's fine. That's all off limits, because that's going to be ecosystem managed. Now, can a US Californian government do this? This is not even in their thinking. So that's what I mean.
Even Jerry Brown, who was probably the greenest governor.
Yeah, but his was all, fuel this and fuel that. I'm saying we have to go much further. My view is, in the Hollywood world, this is not a possibility, but they'll all turn up at the B movies and sign a pledge, right, and make movies about saving the planet. But don't ask them to give up the swimming pool. So I don't expect that to change. But for the rest of the world, this is what has got to happen to change the economic model so that we have a chance. I'm not saying it'll be foolproof, but we're going to have to restrict. So if In Delhi, water constraint, you can't have a swimming pool. That's the law. It's just like in some countries. I think you can't walk around here with a gun, can you?
No.
Right. Someone decided, not such a good idea. True? Public safety, public good. Similarly, that there will be laws that say you can't do certain things because the majority must have the basic rights. And if you, because you have, the wealth, for whatever reason, we are not going to allow you to deprive people who are bottom to even have their basics. And then we will price it through economic measures or through outright bans, which is what I argued. So in consumptionomics, I argued most Asian cities cannot have more cars. They need more cars like I need a hole in my head. But what does the economic model tell us? Industrialization to the automotive industry is the first step up the ladder. It has brought destruction to our cities. We have to do something else. And only the state can intervene.
So what is now the exact best proposal that you have? Is it legislation, regulation, with people stopping people to have excessive goods that are not sustainable if everybody would want them? Or is it pricing and taxing the rich for their excesses?
I think taxation is a different issue. There's a redistribution of income in failed economies. That's a different issue, right? Right. So that's an economic distribution issue of wealth creation.
Well, that's
right.
if you're talking income tax, but you can have consumption tax.
No, you can, exactly. So taxing the rich is a different issue, right? But in terms of the sustainability issue, as I said earlier when we started, the majority don't have. So the obligation of the sustainable state is to meet their basic rights, which doesn't come with freedom of speech, just to be cheeky, right? Freedom of speech is like number 7 or 8, somewhere there. But we'll have to meet these rights.
We were arguing before that.
Yeah.
And I was telling you that...
Don't tell them to journalists.
Yeah, right.
I know. And I know I'm right. That's why they must tell them to journalists. That's why they overreact. They're so reactionary, But that's okay. But so you have to meet those basic rights. To meet that, then the government has to factor in what are the economic conditions that will create essentially more equitable distribution to the resource base that allows these people the fundamental issues. So the resource base could be land, for instance. So let me give you one example. Say Hong Kong, where I live. A form of consumption, a basic right in Hong Kong would be, believe it or not, the right to a home, safe space. I mean, I think you all live in flats, maybe 2,000 square foot, all of that. It's good, right? So, but in Hong Kong, at the moment, I think something like 350 square foot. They are flats, 350 square foot, size of a car park. $500,000 US, right? So changing consumption from just that, but to the consumption of essentially a space to live. The policy of the government has to be not draconian, tough, right? So they have to break the monopoly of essentially the property cartels that have essentially hijacked the system. And the government is party to this. But if you compare an equivalent city, Singapore, and so Hong Kong government can't do that, my point is weak. Because it's got some kind of democratic legislature and they don't want to be part of China. If you want to solve Hong Kong's problem, ask the Chinese government. They'll solve it in 1 week. Okay? Now, for housing. So, okay, and it will give rights.
You've lost the Hong Kong population now.
Sorry?
You've lost your Hong Kong
No,
audience.
the sensible Hong Kong population understand what I mean. I've said this in Hong Kong. In fact, next week I'm speaking, I'll say this. Now, but in Singapore, the government is very tough. And it decided that the basic right to a home and creating social stability and therefore enabling people to escape the burden of the drudgery of daily life without proper home, frustrations, political unrest, is to provide everybody with a safe home. So the Singapore government, under Mr. Lee and all the people, basically said, we will create a system that does not allow land to essentially be auctioned by the government to the best bidder as essentially a free market commodity. Cannot. Part of it will be essentially to meet the needs of the people. And therefore it created that. So it has to be regulations, regulations, and regulations to deal with this, not wealth disparity, but rights disparity.
Now, I come back to a question that I started off in the beginning, because the government, the national government, the strong government, if it's functional as you propose, effective, can make these decisions.
Yes.
And if it's land or water, it's feasible. If it's copper or oil, then you don't think in national terms. I mean, if you're Kazakhstan, you have to decide about gas or oil for your population, there's such an abundance that you cannot restrict it, but you want to export it,
yes.
and then the importing countries have to buy a commodity that they cannot decide upon the sustainability of it. So national governance has enormous limits when it comes to resources, no?
Of course, but then so let's assume, right? Belgium wants copper from Kazakhstan, right? Kazakhstan is an abundance of copper. Selling that copper is not going to deprive its people of some basic rights. In fact, if they sell it, they might be able to use that to essentially upgrade the quality of other basics, right? There are, of course, environmental issues, not sustainability issues. With mining, try and manage that. Okay?
Well, there are sustainability issues as well.
Not for Kazakhstan if it has an abundance.
Yeah.
But Belgium now has to decide, because you all say you want to be a sustainable world, do you want to buy that copper or not? Right?
Yeah.
So that's the hypocrisy that takes place all over the world. I'm not blaming Belgium. So when I go to Canada and speak, and I hope I'm not going to lose my Canadian audience here, my friends, do the Canadians listen to this one?
Everybody listens. It's
my God,
worldwide.
That's great. That's very good.
It's
okay.
a global audience.
So I hope the Kazakhstanis are listening too. Okay. So, what does Canada export? Oil, minerals, and wood. And then they say, but we want to be very sustainable. But everything they export to create the wealth is essentially an unsustainable business model, but they want to sell it, right? So countries at a national scale have to decide, what do we buy or sell in terms of dealing with that issue you're talking about in terms of dilemma, Now, you could say to the Canadians, you've all reached a certain GDP. My God, there's no more need to sell wood. Right? But the economic democratic model of the Canadian system and the Western world is more is better. There is no limits to it. We have to keep going. So I was talking to a leading member of the Club of Rome, who's Norwegian, about what's happening in Norway. Norway's wealth was essentially created on two very undemocratic decisions, right? Someone found oil, it was not Norwegians, and the Norwegians said, good, we will nationalize it. Best decision they ever made. Second, they said, we'll make so much money from this, we are not going to give it to all of you. We are going to manage it, right? So they manage their wealth, small country though, and they become so rich. And he was arguing they become so rich through actually very socialist policies. But now they want everything, and they're in fact undermining the state because they want unfettered freedoms, etc. So I think countries need to decide. That is the start. I come back to whether it's an international relationship or not, it's what you want internally. So Americans have to decide, the few Americans who think about sustainability, what does it actually mean in the context of local policies and buying things from other countries, etc. So this is a fundamental issue of responsibility in the rich world, because it is a rich world, poor world resource exchange, as you point out.
The peak of the thinking to my understanding, is your moderate, how you call it?
Prosperity.
Moderate prosperity, which is not very clearly defined, but I would like you to define it as good as you can for me, because you create this, you have a graph at a certain stage where you show that that is the specter that goes beyond basic rights, but before excessive consumption. So that's the middle class space that would be allowed in your thinking. Is that right?
Yeah. So I deliberately don't go into that in detail because in each country it will be different. And I also don't want to come across in the book, because I'd be so easily accused of being some Stalinist fascist dictating what people can have. I'm already saying something that most people think maybe I'm some sort of fascist from Asia. So
a well-dressed communist, basically.
yeah. But I always say these are terms that were coined in the West. So I don't understand what is this communism, but I do understand there are communal obligations. Yeah. And all societies were based on communal obligations. So I think in different societies it'll be different, but I can give you an example. I think a moderate prosperity will be one in which in certain countries you can't have a car in an urban area, full stop. And my God, you can't have two. And if you have two, we'll charge the hell out of you, right? You can go ahead, but we will charge you. So economic instruments. A moderate prosperity will also include the way urban land is used so that rich people cannot have their enclaves with their golf courses and security guards, because they will be living with other people who have state-built homes and share the amenities of public good, right? So it will not be, we will live in that part and you guys, because the land is everybody's, and that's a moderate prosperity. A moderate prosperity will one be in which heating systems or cooling systems, because we need cooling, you guys need heating. So if you live in the tropics and you want to sleep because you're rich at 19 degrees C and put the aircon, you have the right, but we will use the most advanced technology to charge you $100 an hour for that privilege. So if you want to pay $800 for sleeping at 19 degrees C overnight, good for you. But we will charge you, period. If you sleep at 23 degrees, it might be $50. You see what I mean? And by the way, we have all the technology now to charge you, and you will get your bill through your smartphone. It's okay, next morning. So you can change your behavior the next day.
Because the state is watching what
Not
you're
the
doing.
state, the people.
Well, the state is watching what the Chinese people are doing.
Which state? The Chinese. The Google's been watching you longer than the Chinese state, my friend. So everyone says the Chinese state is watching, but Chinese people ain't too fussed about it. Chinese people are used to being watched. It's a Western obsession about privacy. I'll give you an example. 3 weeks ago, I had one of the most advanced drone companies in the world from China, Shenzhen. The CEO came and spoke at a leadership program I conduct to young entrepreneurs. And his whole use of drone is not to deliver pizzas so that you can watch more Netflix, which is the American version of what a drone should be, delivering more junk to you from Amazon, okay? His whole drone thing was how to improve land use for poor farmers. I won't go into all the details. And they are essentially having hundreds of drones mapping every square inch of unusable land so that how they can turn it with big data into more productive land for farmers. Because there's a big focus in China on rural development so that it's not this constant urbanization and food supply. I won't go into details. And everyone was, wow, so interesting. There were 2 Westerners in the audience.
He said, who's going to pay for this?
No. What about privacy? And all the Asians like, privacy? But you see the obsession. And the Chinese guy was, okay, I better give an intelligent answer. He said, well, the Chinese government just say, keep doing it until we tell you to stop. Meaning, we gave you a license to get the data so that we can have farming systems with technology that employ people, da-da-da. But if you break the law, we will stop you. That's the contract. So not all societies are worried about this. But of course, if you live in societies where this has become an obsession, you won't. But,
But it's not just privacy. I mean, I see the point that you make, but you make it deliberately in a way that you're right. But there is state control.
Of course.
And it is technology enabled.
But you're saying state control is wrong. I'm saying state control is not necessarily wrong. You see what I'm saying? It could be the net benefit. But I'm then also saying, but Google is the state.
Well, Google is not punishing me. It's bugging me.
It's punishing you by getting you to buy all. And who said that? But who said the Chinese state is punishing people?
Well, it's punishing if you walk through the red light.
No. You know what it does? Well, it's telling, hey, Chinese cities are very crowded. It's not like, cities here where like one person walks every 5 minutes through the red lights, So you need order. So if you break the law, where so much is at risk because so many people, you get a discredit. But the upside is you get a trip somewhere. They're doing a lot of interesting things. Now, I totally understand why you're looking at me and thinking, who is this guy talking about this stuff? I totally get it. But you just have to think about societies that are designed completely differently, have a different culture. I often say, other societies do have an appetite for order, authority, and conformity. This is not a bad thing if you believe that other parts of the world are so crowded, so constrained, you need order. It's like my analogy is you go to the European Cup championships, 100,000 people. Do you want order? Do you want every bag to be checked? I think so. But if you live somewhere in the Alps in Switzerland, you kind of like the moment a helicopter goes over, you think, oh my God, the Swiss government's coming to spy on me. But in other parts
they're saving somebody then.
They're saving somebody, but you're worried. But in other parts of the world, people actually crave for order because they know the recent past.
Well,
no order was chaos. No. So, it's... I don't want to give an example of my brothers and sisters in India.
Well,
but my God, do they need order? Do they need the government saying, you will not piss on this wall? And if you do piss on the wall, you know what I mean? No toilet, we will fine you. My God, that would change Indian behavior. And it'll be good, wouldn't it?
It wouldn't work.
It would work if the state was very tough. In China, they changed the behavior of people with public toilets within the space of 15 years. Amazing change of behavior. Not because they said, please all be nice. No, they said, you will do this or we will fine you. It's not a bad thing.
Getting back to the moderate prosperity, I think because it's crucial to understand what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability.
Sure.
As you mean it, it's sustainability, you say, is not the status quo. It's a radical change
yes.
of paradigm and of economy, and the economy will not be driven
yes.
by consumption, but should be driven by basic rights.
Consumption to fulfill first the basic rights in the development state.
Yeah. How do we get there?
How do we get there? Through essentially a competent state that understands this. Because it's not we, actually, it's the large developing countries of the world. As I said earlier, I don't think the rich countries can make that adjustment to another level, because part of the sustainability narrative out of the West avoids one very important and difficult, inconvenient truth, the need to sacrifice. So sacrifice doesn't come into it. Therefore, every solution is some economic instrument that tinkers, something that says technology will solve the problem, but nothing that says you will have to sacrifice. So that's why I don't believe they can change. But for the rest of the world, the way to get there is to first say, for political leaders, and understand, if we don't give the basic rights, so you see I'm sounding now like a true Democrat.
Sounds good.
Right? If we don't fulfill these basic rights, only chaos looms, irrespective of which government system. We have to. We also have an obligation. The only way we can do that is to understand where how the economy is to be organized, and where the rent-seeking and the inefficiencies of the market are taken out, and where abuse of power in terms of access to resources which undermine the rights of others will be factored into our policies. To do that, you cannot, because it's not about market instruments, it's about intervention. So the only way you get there is through strong states. Now, most of our developing countries, as I said before, have no such theoretical framework. The only theoretical framework they have is the Western economic model, which is essentially everyone can have everything. It's trickle-down economics. Make the pie bigger and everyone can. But you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand what I just said, and which I said in my first book. You can't ask 6 billion Asians, which is what the population of Asia will be in 2050, to live European or American lifestyles. No chance.
They love to.
No,
That's the problem.
No, they like to, but they can't. So you're making my point. So we have to stop them. Now you're probably having the difficulty by saying, how can you stop them? Well, you have to. Otherwise, I'm arguing, we have chaos. We have complete meltdown. So to stop them, you have to create a different narrative about a different world vision. People are not born with some view that they need to have a house, 3,000 square foot, a swimming pool, TVs in every room, and 2 cars. That's the Americans sold it to us. It's called advertising. Mm-hmm. But people do also understand the world they live in today. And if this explains, I talk about the pillars of policy in this crowded world, then you create a whole different political philosophy around how there's a coexistence to navigate that. And the how, or the prerequisite, in my view, is the strong state. But it's a state which is very competent. And so I talk about competence.
It's not to be clear, it's not a dictatorship. It's a strong, effective state.
Yeah, I like it that you made that comparison, because why do you think a strong state should be a dictatorship?
No, it's not.
No, but you see, I deliberately don't use the word.
Strong state evokes the idea of a strong leader, and a strong leader.
But don't you want strong leaders?
Develop into dictators if you don't check and balance them.
Not all the time. Lee Kuan Yew was not necessarily a dictator. Okay. Although, so I'm playing with this word strong to say it's an effective state. And the effective state is one that is not the limp democracies today of the West, which are ineffectual. That's a weak state. So today I would argue the United States is a weak state because it can't do anything within its borders, but it's supposedly a great democracy. Then you could look at around Europe, and you're all going through your pains about populism, etc. And we could talk about that in historical context. But it is actually the pain of shifting to a new world order, right? So they become weak states. We can argue about the French yellow jackets, etc., and whether the policy is right or wrong by Macron. But essentially, people do not want to adjust, and the policies may be bad. But the rest of the world have a different problem. We have an opportunity and a first obligation to raise people, but because there are such large numbers, and only the minority today have, the opportunity is to essentially create a new society through the presence of competent, strong states.
I return to a remark I made in the beginning as well. Can you do that when you leave, when the West is still consuming, when you say, okay, we won't be able to change the West anytime soon, so we'll leave it at that. And we go to Asia and we tell the people, if we do what they do,
Kaput.
we'll sink the whole place.
Yes.
So we have to save it.
Yes.
And we'll leave them consuming because they're unhappy anyway. That won't work. People want their cars. People want their
No. They
aircos.
can't have it, is what I'm saying. They can't have it. Okay? Now, you see, this is very important to understand. When you start describing that narrative and describe cars have created nightmares in most Asian cities, then people say, yeah, but instead, we'll have the best public transport. Everything's transformed, right? It's different. So car ownership levels in Singapore, they have very strict rules about cars. You know that. Very strict. So it's something you have to, if you believe with me, and I know that's what your magazine's thinking about these issues, if we have an exceptional threat, please think exceptional ideas. Do not be constrained. The future is one in which we can't have these things in our part of the world. That doesn't mean we are going to say you'll remain poor. No. We're going to have a different form of understanding how that future will look like, because if we go down this route of more cars, halfway down the route, halfway down the journey, the thing will collapse. But you've been to many parts of this world. In many parts, they've already collapsed. You know that. The data is out there. So government leaders have to take this and describe it, rather than believing the nonsense that comes out of the business schools in the West and the economic institutions, because they're caught in a trap. They want Asia to grow because their economies depend on Asians consuming more of all that stuff. And the ideological supremacy that our economic model works. To give up that idea that our economic model is supreme is to lose a place in the world too. So we have to change very differently. So people cannot have. They have to do different things. I was in Zurich. I went to a Swiss restaurant to eat that. You know the cheese with potato? What's it called?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Raclette. Yeah.
And I nearly walked out because they opened the kitchen doors, an Indian guy making it. I said, God damn it. I came here to eat some Swiss food and some Indian guy is making it. It's terrible. Anyway.
They can do.
They can. It tasted all right, but not really. I think there was a bit of masala in it. But anyway. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is those things have to be taken as the way forward, and we have to change the narrative. So without overstating it, what am I trying to do here? I'm writing 2 books, because no Asians write about this, to say we have to change. Because if we listen to the Western guys who are talking about sustainability, their view is a very myopic view, because they don't cut into the rights issue. No Westerner can say, hey, sorry guys, you cannot have what we have. I can say it. And then I can put in the context that this is essentially what brings greater stability and lack of collapse. The political motivation for political leaders is, if we want to survive, hey, this narrative we can do because the majority will support us. But they only know one thing: free market, trickle-down economics. They went to Harvard Business School, and that's all they know. Sounds very simple, but that's all they know.
Chandran, if you would live in a sustainable state, what would you have to give up?
What would I have to give up? I would, in terms of what I have now, okay. I think, I can say that, but one of the things people do try to catch me out on sometimes is, so, do you have a car? And I say, whether I have a car or not, or whether you vilify me, does not change the argument, because that's personal. But I don't have a car. Do you eat meat? I said, whether I eat meat or not doesn't matter. Are you trying to knock me down because you have no real argument? Not you, I mean, the other people. that doesn't matter. In fact, you make my point. Even the good guys succumb. The good guys need rules, but I don't eat meat. So, but are there more things I should give up? Of course, and I should play by the rules. So I would be very happy for more rules to essentially limit the bad behavior of those who can have, because we all behave badly. So I know in Europe there's talk about green consumers. This is nonsense. The consumer is a fool. I know politically not nice to say, but just go to the supermarket, right? So, you know, the idea that people will behave well is sort of utopian. Over time, people's behaviors will change as expectations of how you should behave will change and rules kick in.
But that needs, and we'll wrap up there, that needs more than a strong state, that needs a cultural revolution as well. And I'm not using it as a reference to the
Chinese one. No, yeah. No, you need cultural revolution, of course. But cultural revolution, in terms of the cultural change, we must work on that. But we have, you know, if you believe the IPCC report is 12 years, the changes we require, and to meet the basic needs, if you look at India housing, it's 60, 70 years. So it's going to be messy. So we're going to have to work at that. And that let's do that. But that's not going to solve the problem. But eventually, people's behaviors are shaped by rules. And I don't want to bore you again with China, but toilets in China today are generally very clean. They changed it in 15 years. Propaganda, 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 tough rules, tough rules, tough rules, monitoring, 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 change the mindset. Not everyone can be Japanese.
So more Buddhism won't solve the riddle. It's rules and repression.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people like this, you know, so Indians, maybe more Hindu and Buddha and a bit of yoga. I mean, this is fantasy. You know, the Buddhists, the Hindus, they all misbehave. So, but then they go and pray a lot so that they can hide their misbehaving. But so I know this. I know my brothers and sisters. So forget that. I mean, when I wrote my first book, I was interviewed by someone from BBC, and they said, "So do you believe?" Because I look like an Indian, you know, there's some spiritual core in the Hindu thing. I said, "I don't think so." Because they think we all stand on our heads, do yoga and stuff like that, and eat vegetarian food. No, they all misbehave, and then there's only so much to go because people are scrambling. So you need order to essentially organize a very messy, to be more serious, messy conditions. And you know, I'll end on the note: if 600 million Indians, which is about the number here or there, don't have what is called a permanent home, this is not going to be solved, which is, I consider, one of the most basic human rights, to take away the insecurity of drudgery, etc., from people. You can have the toilet, you can have the water, etc. It brings all of that together. This is not going to be solved by free market economies and FDI in India and Indians working for Walmart and saving in a bank. This takes a completely different view of how the Indian government essentially solves a basic rights problem using its abilities, because it's powerful, but it needs to be organized. And to be organized, it needs a political system that works. So, you know, that's fundamentally the challenge. And, you know, I often say, so if you're poor today, would you rather be Chinese or Indian?
And we know what you would choose.
I think most Indians would choose too.
Okay, thank you very much, Chandran, for this engaging conversation.
Thank you.